Hello to Mike Billington from Executive Intelligence Review. Is that how you want to be
Sure.
recognized? Yeah.
Yep.
And
And you can say on LaRouche Pack.
yeah, okay. Uh, so I hear that Greece has made a deal.
Well, that's that's questionable. They've made dozens of deals. Each one lasts about 10 minutes until it's figured out that it won't work, both because it wouldn't solve the financial problem and because the population is in a state of actual revolution, which is just going to be provoked if they actually try to impose one of these genocidal, deadly policies. So we'll see.
Channel 4 News this evening at 7 o'clock this evening, headlined with Greece having made a deal. By 7:30, they had some people on from Europe saying actually there was no deal.
Yeah.
So it seems to be a fairly fluid situation.
Now, none of these things will work. That's the key point, is that, the question of, gee, did they have a deal? Did the stock market go up today on the basis of, this is going to be solving the European problem? It's all nonsense. None of these deals can possibly work. They know they can't work. They're buying time. And in the case of the very highest levels of the British monarchy and the financial empire, they are buying time to start the war, because their view is that the only way they can actually continue their global financial power at this point is by unleashing a war which drags the United States into conflict with Russia and China, military thermonuclear conflict with Russia and China, in order to prevent the United States and Russia and China from working together to put together a new global financial system. Based on development, based on science drivers, based on growth and development. That is the primary enemy. That and the world population are viewed as the primary enemy of this financial empire, and Prince Philip's policy of reducing the world's population from the current 7 billion down to about 1 or less. One of the easiest ways to achieve that, in their view, would be to proceed with the thermonuclear war, targeting Asia, where most of the world's people live, and finish off this population issue once and for all. But it's also
yeah, of
geopolitically.
Course, what most people would say is that thermonuclear war seems like an unlikely option since they live on this planet as well.
That doesn't seem to bother them. And this is increasingly recognized by the top Russian leadership and the top Chinese leadership. Saying most people would say, as you just did, not to criticize your saying that, because I know what you mean, but it sounds like those who argue in the halls of the United Nations and so forth that the world community says that, Assad must step down in Syria. The world community believes that Iran must completely finish its nuclear program, peaceful nuclear program, and so forth. Well, that's not the world community, and it's not most people. Most people are Asians and Eurasians, and the majority of the people's political representatives today are saying very loudly, as Mr. Putin, Mr. Rogozin, the former Russian ambassador to NATO, who's now the vice premier, and others are saying that this wild recklessness of the British and their boy Obama in provoking a war against Iran and Syria and encircling Russia with missile defense systems, which Hillary Clinton had made an agreement with Lavrov and the Russians earlier, that they would not do such a thing without complete collaboration with the Russians. Now Obama says, we're going ahead no matter what. Rasmussen, the head of NATO, in a head-on-head fight, really, with Rogozin just last week, Rogozin laid out very clearly that this missile defense system has nothing to do with Iran. They don't have a missile system in Iran that can hit Europe. It has nothing to do with anyone except targeting our missiles, trying to neutralize our defenses. And if this proceeds, we will have to take necessary actions. Rasmussen's response? Gee, we'd like to have a deal, but we're going ahead whether you like it or not. And this is recognized by the Russians as a move towards war which will be thermonuclear. We're dealing here with the thermonuclear powers in the world: Russia, China, the United States. Even Pakistan is, by some accounts, and this is not definitive, it's not coming from the Pakistan government, but by certain diplomatic counts, the Pakistanis believe that if this war on Iran is unleashed, first by the Israelis, of course, but with the intention of dragging the United States into that conflict, which is the imperial plan, the British imperial idea, is to drag the U.S. into this, not with Iran as the target. Iran will be bombed, but the target is conflict with Russia and conflict with China, and that will become thermonuclear if Pakistan, I didn't finish that. What they're saying is that if this attack on Iran takes place, Pakistan may have to come in the defense of Iran. And of course, Pakistan is a nuclear power with some dozens of nuclear weapons and the capacity to deliver them. So we are sitting on the brink of global thermonuclear war, closer than the world has been to world war at any point in history, far beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis, far beyond the guns of August that launched World War I. We are on the brink. And as long as this fanatic, Obama, is in the White House, effectively making his secret deals with Wall Street and the City of London, deploying his friend Dennis Ross, who is no longer his advisor on the Middle East, but who is privately his spokesman negotiating with Netanyahu in Israel, effectively trying to give them the green light. They've already basically given them green light. The only thing holding this back at this point is very, very strong condemnation of this policy by leading U.S. military leaders, including active duty, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and many retired four-star generals who are vociferously arguing that this must be stopped. This is insane. It's going to that the U.S. it can't be won on the terms that are being posed by the Israelis and the British and the United States and the French and others. It cannot be won. It's a policy whose only purpose is to drive that war between the United States and Asia, to prevent the cooperation between these great powers, to replace this bankrupt global financial Anglo-American, New York, London financial dollar-based system, bankrupt completely, the entire banking system collapsing, as you know. Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy is the big potato, and Spain, gone. The euro is finished. It's a dead currency. It's on borrowed time right now. Could go any minute, literally any minute. Certainly by March 20th, when the Greeks have to come up with their next debt payment, which they cannot do, even if this vicious 25% in wages and pensions, that's the deal that you were referring to earlier, even if that were implemented, it wouldn't anywhere near give them the capacity to pay their debts. And in fact, the earlier agreement to make the banks accept a haircut on the Greek debt. Originally, it was going to be 50%. Now they're acknowledging that without 80%, it won't help any. And in fact, even 80% wouldn't help. But they cannot get the agreement of the banks. So this is a deal where neither side has their act together. It's a false buying of time, which has to be seen as a buying of time for war. And it's with that sense of urgency that LaRouche, my organization, and I know people around you in England are doing what they can to join forces with those in Russia and those in Israel, very serious leading forces in Israel who are trying to stop this atrocity. But we don't have much time. And we can get into that because the problem here in the United States is very, very intense, severe.
Well, also on the news this evening is when the news about this alleged Greek deal came out, they're talking about a 48-hour national strike being called already in Greece. We've got, I can tell you that in Plymouth here and in other parts of the UK, we're seeing an influx now of people from Portugal, which probably means that people are starting to suffer badly in Portugal from unemployment, and so they're coming here looking for some kind of job.
Youth unemployment in Portugal and Spain, it's even worse, is in the range of 40 to 50%. That's youth unemployment. Overall unemployment is in the 20 to 25 range.
Right.
It's
so we're seeing a
astonishing.
complete collapse of society in most of Europe.
Yeah.
So at the sort of at the ground level, we must be looking at civil unrest in parallel with the sort of geopolitical moves towards initially attacks on Syria and Iran and ultimately Russia and China. So really we're looking at a complete breakdown of Western so-called civilization.
We were talking about the breakdown of civilization as seen already in what's going on in Greece, possibly Portugal, with people from Portugal pouring into Plymouth. Doesn't surprise me, but I'm interested to hear it. The vast youth unemployment there. In Greece, there's a couple of people whose names I can't recall, but one of them is quite famous because as a very, very young man, he took down the flag, the Nazi flag, from the Acropolis and was part of the resistance movement as a teenager. And he's sort of famous in Greece, as I understand it. So he and another activist of sorts have put out a very clear document telling the truth, which is that I think 65 years ago, does that ring? 65 years ago, he said, we defeated the fascist scourge that had swept through our nation and all of Europe, and swore that this would never happen again. And now we're facing, he said, a new kind of fascism directed by the financial empire, imposing the destruction of our industries, the destruction of our economy, the destruction of our livelihoods, the destruction of everything that Greece represents as a nation, our sovereignty, and that this is as much fascism and as dangerous to civilization as was the Nazi scourge at that time. And this is truthful. This is the accurate a way to approach this. It's the only way to approach it. And as you know, we've discussed before, Mike, the Hitler machine was put in power by Montague Norman out of the Bank of England, his friends from the Harriman Brothers firm, including George Prescott Bush, the grandfather of our former president, who funded and placed in power this Nazi disaster for the purpose of collecting the World War I debts and to the purpose of basically trying to get the Russians and the Germans to destroy each other in a war. It didn't go the way they'd planned, of course, and the United States jumped in not because they wanted to defend the British-funded financial apparatus, but because they recognized that they'd created a monster, a Frankenstein, in this Nazi regime. So we joined and defended the British and the others, the rest of the world really, against this Nazi scourge. But when that scourge was defeated, that the people who had funded the financial angels of the fascist movement very rapidly came back to power and did everything in their power to destroy what Roosevelt had built up as a counter to this kind of fascist economics, fascist attack on sovereignty across Europe, and fought to restore the American system, what is known as a creditary system rather than the monetary systems which dominate Europe and the United States at this point under the Federal Reserve style system and the structures that you have with central banking. And to restore the idea of national banking, governments that take the responsibility of directing credit into those things needed for the general welfare of the nation. This was the American system as opposed to the British free market, free trade system that we fought a revolution for, and we fought the War of 1812 for, and the Civil War for, against free trade in human beings, against slavery and drugs, like in the Opium Wars that were going on at the same time. That was what America represented at the time. And Roosevelt restored that, but after the war, it was systematically taken down. With his untimely death and the takeover of Truman, who was effectively a puppet of these London, New York financial interests. And instead of ending colonialism once and for all, the way Roosevelt had insisted, the way he told Winston Churchill that there was not, we were not fighting that war to preserve the British Empire, And instead, Truman came in and actually helped the British and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese back into their colonies. And we went through another 30 years war in Asia, in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and in Africa, that were totally unnecessary, that could have been avoided simply by maintaining the U.S., Russia, China alliance, drag the British and the other Europeans along with us in that sense. They would have prospered by such a global development policy. But this went against the grain of what Lyndon LaRouche calls the oligarchical principle, which is the principle of Aristotelian belief that there are certain people born as masters and certain people born as slaves. The imperial power has to rule in order to govern the world. And these are the people who gave birth to this green environmentalist nonsense, this idea that human beings are polluting the earth, and that in fact it gives rise to the genocidal policy that we should reduce the world's population, that the earth can't sustain this many people. And these are the issues at stake. These are the same issues that we fought fascism for in the 1930s.
The ultimate aim of this war policy is Russia. Obviously, Putin has an election coming up in the not too distant future, and he's going to attempt to stand for president again. He's been making comments particularly on, well, it's reported on Russia Today, particularly, that he's been making comments about Western money flowing in and attempting to influence the election process, particularly over the recent elections and obviously over the coming elections as well. It's pretty clear that a lot of that money seems to be coming through Georgia and from George Soros. So I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that and
that's one source. It's coming in directly through the National Endowment for Democracy and other NGOs directly into Russia. Look, the key thing here is that Obama, this puppet of the British imperial structure, just appointed a man educated at Oxford, trained as a subverter of sovereign nations, what they like to call regime change, the new colonialism, trained at Oxford along with Susan Rice, by the way, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. They just appointed this guy, Michael McFaul, to be ambassador to Russia, a guy who's written a book on how to take Putin down, who has sworn, the book was called, I believe, The Unfinished Revolution, meaning we haven't gotten rid of Putin yet, and has been, it describes himself as not a Russian expert, but an expert in political revolution and regime change. Susan Rice, educated at Oxford with a degree, a doctor's dissertation on how to overthrow Zimbabwe, which, as you know, is the nation most hated by the British oligarchy, precisely because it's the only country that stood up and demanded that they have their land rights restored to them as they'd been promised when they were given independence. So he was demonized. Rice was part of that. In the UN last week, after the veto by Russia and China of the war bill, and it was a war bill. It was a bill to bring sanctions against Syria. But as we all know now from the Libya example, these resolutions are intended to create an environment in which there's no stopping the war policy, the regime change, fostering of civil war, fostering of the colonial destruction of sovereign states. So they stood up and said no. Said we're not going to vote for it. They vetoed it. And immediately Susan Rice got up on the floor and said, "This is disgusting." And she said it with that tone of voice. "This is disgusting. It's the blood that flows in Syria will be on the hands of Mr. Putin and his Russian and Chinese friends for refusing to allow us to go in and save the poor, innocent population." Now, we know what's going on in Syria. And as you might know, have you read what we've said, Mike, about the Arab mission there, the report which they released?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Okay. This is really quite devastating because, as you and all of your listeners know, every Western press report, and I'm sure it's the same in Europe as it is in the United States, say that the Arab League's mission came back unsatisfied, that they'd been stymied in their efforts, that they were not able to stop the Syrian government from their brutal massacre of the unarmed civilians and so forth. Well, that report was turned over to the Arab League, and it was not released to the United Nations before they had this vote on these sanctions against Syria. It's now being leaked. It's coming out in bits and pieces, but the report says quite the opposite. The report it does say that they're calling for the end of the violence on both sides, but it focuses on the fact that the armed resistance is being armed from the outside, probably by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but clearly directed through the Anglo-American cartel which is running this, armed to the purpose of bringing about the brutal destruction of the country. The Arab League report says that they are guilty of bombing pipelines, bombing towers, have bombed a civilian bus, killing 8 or 10 people, of launching armed assaults against military forces, of destroying a mosque, a Shia mosque, because really what's happening in Syria is just an extension of this new Shia-Sunni conflict, which is being restored into being the basis for creating chaos throughout the region. So you're dealing here with armed terrorists. And of course, there's also people in Syria who are opposed to the regime and who are demonstrating. But what you're looking at here is an armed civil war, being armed from the outside. When they call for an arms embargo, they don't mean to stop the arms flow to the rebels, as we saw in Libya.
Yeah, so I noticed, for example, I noticed, for example, a news report about arms being stopped through Turkey, allegedly from Iran, of course.
Allegedly, yeah.
Allegedly, yeah. Supposedly going to the Syrian government, but of course, there's no mention of the arms that are going through Turkey to the opposition groups.
Yeah, no, this is a clear situation, and Syria is just a stepping stone to the war in Iran. Both are crucial to the Russians. So in either case, you're talking about a direct confrontation. The Russians just sent their top people down there, Lavrov and I believe the head of their intelligence unit, I forget, were just in Syria, basically offering, according to some intelligence, to identify who is arming the opposition, who are always called defecting soldiers in the newspapers, but in fact they're not. Most of them, in fact, are not even Syrians. There are many, many people coming in from Libya and from Saudi Arabia and fighting in this al-Qaeda type structure, which is what it is, in fact. In order to try to bring down this regime and create further chaos in the region.
Well, the media here is now at least acknowledging that there is an armed resistance, and that's a relatively new thing in the last couple of weeks. But they're still presenting them very much as being a ragtag band of people with a few Kalashnikovs and not much else, and that's clearly no longer the case.
No, they're usually described as defectors in what I've seen, but there are probably some defectors, but the vast majority are these very carefully trained insurgents being funded to the purpose of bringing down this government. Sorry, hold on a second. Leave that off the hook. The only way, I'm sorry, hold on. The only way you can begin to understand this lunacy is through what we were discussing before. It's being driven by the financial breakdown crisis. They see no way out of this. There's no way to keep printing money because we've now reached the point with I believe the EU is now talking about $1.5 trillion more dollars to be pumped into the European banking system, most of it coming from the Federal Reserve through the swap agreement that Bernanke set up with the European Central Bank. So a lot of this is American dollars being pumped directly into this system. But it's now been calculated that to unwind these positions, to deleverage the banking structure, is going to mean something in the range of $4 or $5 trillion soon, in order to successfully if they were to successfully unwind the leveraged process. It can't happen. You're talking about a hyperinflation like 1923 Germany, where the currency becomes useless. The hyperinflation is already in the system. It hasn't broken out in massive inflation, food inflation, and so forth. But the inflation is beginning, as you know. But the massive hyperinflation is already in the system and just ready to sort of break out into the commodity markets if this thing is not reversed through the Glass-Steagall process that you have written about as we have.
Well, I mean, what we're saying here is actually possibly a precursor to that inflation, because we're seeing a massive deflation in the sense that in our supermarkets and our high streets, we're seeing 70-80% reductions in prices in order to just try and get rid of the stuff that's on the shelves. And we're also seeing massive consolidation in suppliers as well. So Britain now has just seen a large buyout of some of the food producers in this country to produce a huge conglomerate, which means that you know the argument then is that for other suppliers to compete, they're also going to have to consolidate in some way. So we're going to end up with one or two massive corporations supplying Britain with its food, and there you know with the shutdown in retail in the retail sector, and obviously that's going to have an impact on delivery companies and whatnot. The infrastructure that's required in order to supply product is collapsing. So clearly there's although we're seeing price reductions at the moment, there's not much in place that's going to prevent prices from rising in the very, very near future.
Yeah, right. The reality is that there's an actual shortage of food. You know, the speculative side of this has been identified by many people, that whenever there's shortages in delivery, the speculators jump into the commodity markets and drive up the prices. But the result is of this process over time of the consolidation of the cartels, the Cargills and the Bungies and so forth, is that the actual food is no longer there. Marcia Baker just published last week in our Executive Intelligence Review, and I encourage your listeners to go to the Executive Intelligence Review website, which is LaRouche Pub, P-U-B, LaRouchePub.com, or to our political website, LaRouche PAC. But on the LaRouchePub.com, we have this article by Marcia Baker on the actual food shortages that are now global. The one that comes to my mind quickly is that the herds in the United States, the beef herds, are now at their lowest level since they kept track, since back in the 1920s or something like that. Because basically farmers are being pushed into consolidating and contracting. Of course, a lot of our corn and other crops are being burned as ethanol, which is just criminal. And the just-on-time food process, where third world nations have been forced by the IMF and the World Trade Organization and so forth to not be food self-sufficient. The argument is it's wasteful to be food self-sufficient as a nation, that you're hurting your poor by maintaining support for food because it drives the prices up slightly domestically. So you should open up your markets completely, have no kind of protection for rice or anything else. And most of these countries have done so. The case in my mind is Indonesia, which eats a great deal of soy cake. It's sort of their staple called tempeh. And they were forced to give up self-sufficiency in soy. And then the soy price absolutely skyrocketed back in 2008. I think it was 4 or 5-fold that the price went up. There were no more producers, or not enough producers in Indonesia, and they couldn't afford to buy the incoming soy. So what happened? People don't eat, or they had to switch to importing more rice at inflated prices, and so forth. So the end result is you're producing less food than is needed by the human race. And that's the reality we're facing, actual starvation, facing even the United States in the very near term as a result of this kind of global financial destruction.
which of
It's
course is
destruction of the
genocide because
physical economy.
it's genocide because it's policy.
Yeah, absolutely. It is policy. This is exactly the reason they do this. Food is a weapon, but as you said, also as a policy for starvation. A weapon in terms of controlling governments, and a policy in terms of basically keeping the world at a depopulated pace of development. Now, this is the kind of thing that has to be broken through politically. And here in the United States, I mean, the situation is really very dire. It's not absolutely hopeless, but it's very dire. The Democratic Party has now completely sold out. Over the last few weeks, it became very clear that the top Democratic leadership has given up on any opposition to these genocide and war hawk policies of this lunatic president, Obama, that they're going along with this insane electoral game of, we have to support this side against the Republicans because the Republicans are worse than the Democrats. The fact of the matter is that Obama and these lunatic Republican candidates are advocating exactly the same policies on every fundamental issue. The issue of bailing out Wall Street is simply not being discussed in the campaign. The question of global war, they all agree. We have to prepare to wage more regime change wars of the sort that Obama has made himself famous for, now even worse than Bush and Cheney were. So this is a disaster. Your associate, John Morton, a few weeks ago, complained to me that we were giving credence to Hillary Clinton, as somebody around who had a faction of Democrats who had the potential of replacing Obama if Obama were removed through impeachment or through the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which the fourth section, which is about a president incompetent to serve for mental inability, which is absolutely clear about this narcissist Nero president that we have. And I responded to your friend at that time and our friend, that, he had to understand that there were things going on behind the scenes, that she worked for Obama. She had to maintain and say certain things, but she also had to be in place if, in fact, you could knock this guy out. Well, that was unfortunately thrown out a few weeks ago, where even the Clintons at this point have bought in entirely to the idea that they're going to have to back this lunatic to become president. And if that process continues, not only to the election, but far, far before the election, in March and April and May this year, before November, we're going to see not only the complete collapse of the entire Western financial system, but we're going to see very possibly global thermonuclear war. And this is the urgency with which we have to awaken leaders and the population. And as you probably know, LaRouche's response to this is that we have only one choice. We have to launch a science driver policy, which you can reflect on how Kennedy mobilized the American people behind the space program and inspired really the whole world about going to the moon and going to Mars. We have to do that now. It's all we have. We don't have political leadership in the party structures to do anything, but we do have the potential of focusing on the great projects like the Moon Mars project, like the NWAPA project that you've written about as well, of the water down from the Arctic to green the deserts in the American far west. And in the process, building the tunnel under the Bering Strait to work with the Russians and the Chinese and the Koreans and the Japanese and others on the development of this vast, undeveloped far east of Russia with vast resources, vast potential. And from there, launching into the Arctic, another area of tremendous potential. And as you might have seen, the Russians have just done some quite dramatic breakthroughs in Antarctica in terms of the kind of things where we can begin to develop these very, very difficult terrains, Siberia, the Arctic, and so forth, both for their own value, but also because this prepares us to begin to build the colonies on the moon and eventually on Mars and beyond, that we must be focusing on today, that we must be focusing our youth on today, if we're going to survive this current threat to the very existence of civilization. And it's this science driver that has to be the basis around which we build this international alliance. Our leadership for this now is LaRouche. Our team, especially the so-called basement team of these young scientists who are working with LaRouche on these issues, the key Russians who are repeatedly insisting that the collapse of physical economics in the West is a disaster for mankind, and calling on, in fact, the same Rogozin, the ambassador to NATO, is the one who called for the U.S. and Russia to work together in the development of the Arctic, while Putin has called for an SDE. You remember LaRouche's SDI, or what became called the SDI under Reagan, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the idea of a space-based laser defense or particle beam defense capacity to defeat nuclear weapons rather than just blow each other up through mutual assured destruction. The Russians have extended that even further to call it SDE, Strategic Defense of Earth, to defend against rogue missiles, but also to defend against the possibility of an asteroid or something large hitting and destroying the Earth, which is a very real possibility that we have to take into consideration, especially given the extremely volatile activity in the sun and other galactic developments that are taking place in our time. So these are the issues. How do you do that? How do you inspire people to this kind of science driver? You have to focus attention on the reality of the fate of the human race being on the line. And either we go to hell with these oligarchs, or we launch the revolution and the Renaissance that's possible and necessary.
So on a very practical level then, I mean, how do you see that happening? We have a situation where, well, I don't know how it is in the States, but in the UK at the moment we have this Leveson inquiry going on, which is absolutely going to shut down the British media. Bad enough as it is already. What we're going to end up with is purposeless, really. We've got legislation pending in the States and probably similar here to more or less shut down the internet. So how actually do we organize people along those lines if there is no political leadership and no cultural leadership of any kind in this direction, and while particularly while organizations remain relatively small, what have you got?
Well, here in the West, we have that leadership. I mean, that's the truth. I hope you've been reading about Jacques Cheminade in France, who is the head of our sort of sister organization in France, who's been a collaborator of LaRouche for 40 years, who was part of was an up-and-coming French government official, actually, when he met LaRouche at the UN and became a collaborator and then founded his own party. And he has just shocked France by succeeding in getting the 500 signatures from mayors in France to be a presidential candidate, while Le Pen, the daughter of Le Pen, who's now trying to be a right-wing candidate, couldn't get those signatures. It's not easy to get these signatures, especially with the political pressure that's put on people not to support a LaRouche-associated person or somebody as well-known in France as Cheminade. And why? Well, for many reasons, but I would say the most important is because Cheminade has for 40 years, or close to that, been warning that the global financial system was heading for this collapse, which is now evident to all, and that the only solution to this is the Glass-Steagall as developed under the Roosevelt leadership in the United States, an absolute separation of the commercial banks and the investment banks, that the government would give absolutely no guarantees to the speculative investment banks, that they would only guarantee commercial banks under very strict regulation, that those banks could not participate in any speculation, stocks and bonds, derivatives, insurance, none of that. They could only take in deposits and lend into productive enterprise, education, schools, industry, infrastructure, agriculture. This was the way that America was founded. This is the way America built itself up. Under Roosevelt, we didn't go completely back to the national banking system, but through Glass-Steagall, we were able to direct the nation's credit into these kinds of necessary reconstruction for the general welfare, and it worked. And in fact, we lived off it for the next 40 years after the war. It was destroyed. We've watched the complete takeover by these London, New York speculative genocide merchants, advocates of this free market, free trade lunacy, who have destroyed the European banking system and the American banking system, bankrupted it massively. And now they're paying the consequences, as we've discussed. Their only alternative here, they know you can't bail this thing out. Their only choice is war and dictatorship to impose the genocidal austerity policies necessary for them to maintain this fictitious, worthless debt which represents no investment in anything productive, but pure gambling debts, trillions and trillions, perhaps 1,000 trillion, a quadrillion. That's by some estimates how much of this derivative bubble is weighting down the real physical economy. And so Jacques Cheminade, now a French presidential candidate, one of only 3 or perhaps 4, is leading a fight for this policy. They can't repress it. So this kind of fight by an individual standing up against, all popular opinion is what's required at a time like this. Now, if you can't get on the ballot, still, you have to take the responsibility of being the spokesman for these policies globally. That's the West. It's very important also, though, to keep in mind that we have allies. And the allies are not in Europe and not in the United States, outside of the LaRouche movement and a few key institutions around the military and the intelligence community who understand this strong allies in Russia. We have allies in China. There's key people in Japan and Korea who want this. In fact, I would say, get your nation to look at what's happening in Asia, where the nations tend to be coming together in the midst of a globe which is being wrecked apart, pulled apart. And yet the Asian nations have a tendency to recognize that they have to congeal at this point, to work together on real physical development, regional infrastructure development, railroads, water, power, and so forth. And they're calling on the United States to join them in this, and Europe, although they recognize that Europe is now basically destroyed, a group of non-sovereign nations falling apart one by one, who gave up their sovereignty to the euro, but willing to bring them in if they can, once they get something established. And this view of Asia progressing is, on the one hand, inspiring to anybody who can be brought to look at it in a serious way. And in the eyes of the oligarchy in London and New York, that's the enemy. They cannot allow Asia to continue this developmental process while they're trying to impose these genocidal austerity policies on every country in Europe and the United States. Therefore, war. Therefore, they're going to war. And if they don't get stopped by us through inspiring the population and key leaders to take these steps now, then the consequence is going to be the very real threat to the very existence of civilization as we know it today.
Okay, well, we better win in that case.
We'd better. And we can. We can. I mean, the human race has proven over and over again that it's capable of responding, especially to these kinds of crises, by launching a renaissance, launching true revolution, not, wild lefty revolution, but revolution of the sort you saw with the American Revolution, revolutions that are necessary to restore sanity against this kind of oligarchical principle. And it's the time to do it. It's a dangerous time. But again, throughout history, it's really only in a crisis this great that people begin to give up their illusions, their false axioms. They're sort of wishing that nothing bad can happen to them because they are going to prevent it. They, the ruling powers. Well, when those illusions are shattered, like today, then people begin to think. We've discussed before. This is what Shelley was talking about in The Defense of Poetry, where at the end of that essay, he says that it's crises like this in which people are capable of pondering profound thoughts about man and nature, that in normal times they don't even want to think about and can't. But you have to appeal to that idea inside the human spirit, that idea of creativity that's in every human being, even if they've been dumbed down and have never really used their creative powers at all. It's there. You have to pull it out. You have to inspire it through great art, through great science, through this science driver concept, through great music. These are the issues that are our responsibility, even if we might seem like we're practically alone. But we can and we must succeed in this moment of crisis, in this moment of opportunity.
Okay, well, that's about an hour, Mike. So I think we'll leave it at that. And thank you
Okay?
very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks.